This is a video on Bhagavad-Gita chapter 2. As we discussed in the last video on chapter 1, when Arjuna sees armies comprising his relatives gathered to fight and die on opposite sides, he gives arguments against the war. We discussed how his arguments are divided into three categories, namely emotional, moral, and rational. In each argument, Arjuna addresses Krishna by a different name, calling him Govinda, Janardana, Varshaneya, and so on, citing Krishna's own nature to support his arguments. Basically, Arjuna says that as Govinda, you please everyone, so how can you ask me to fight? Or as Janardhan, you protect the whole society, so how can you ask me to attack my own relatives? Or as Varshaneya, you protect your family and clan, so how can you expect me to destroy these clans? And yet, despite these arguments, Arjuna is not filled with pride, but with grief. That is a sign of Arjuna knowing that something is wrong, although he doesn't know exactly what. Devotees of the Lord sometimes argue with the Lord, but the Lord doesn't mind that argumentation because the bond of affection is stronger than the arguments. Thus, there is a difference between arguments based on ignorance and malice. The Lord corrects the arguments based on ignorance, but separates himself from those arguing based on malice. This principle is used by the teachers of the Vedic tradition too. They can read the mood of the person, not just the arguments. If the arguments are sincere rather than malicious, the person is educated. Otherwise, he is abandoned. He has to suffer in life and then become humble. And then, when he asks questions sincerely, then his questions are answered. The simple symptom of a person asking sincerely is that he is in grief, but that of a person asking with malice is that he is arrogant. So, just by reading the mood, the questions of the sincere people are answered and those of the arrogant people are ignored. That is because the malicious and arrogant person is not looking to be educated, but focused on winning the argument and defeating the opponent. Since Arjuna is grief stricken, therefore, in this chapter, we see how Krishna begins by addressing his grief, arising out of the belief that he is about to kill his family. Krishna tells Arjuna that the soul is never killed and only the body is killed. Then Krishna gives four kinds of arguments to Arjuna. These are based on three gunas and then transcending the guna. The tamoguna state leads a person to grief, weakness, neglect of duty, infamy, and degradation. The rajoguna state takes a person to a higher status in the universe, such as the heavenly planets. The sattva state takes a person to knowledge, where he does his duties selflessly, fearless of material gain and loss. Finally, a transcendental realization takes a person beyond these three inferior states. The implication is that Krishna progressively counters the state of tamoguna, rajoguna, sattva and then goes beyond the gunas. Now, the significant thing is that Arjuna remains quiet on Krishna countering the guna and inquires about the transcendental state. He doesn't ask how he can get fame and fortune in this world, or how he could go to heavenly planets, or how to live in this world detached. He only asks about the transcending state. His inquiry shows that he is already very advanced in a spiritual sense, even though his foregoing questions and comments seem to indicate that he is in a depressed state. And so, after that, the whole conversation becomes transcendental. Of course, this transcendental state is not attained easily. For example, to a person in tamoguna, we can prescribe austerities to raise them. Then to a person in rajoguna, we can prescribe detached duty to raise them. Then to a person in sattva we can prescribe the study of Vedic texts to raise them. Then to a person convinced of a transcendental state, we can prescribe devotion to the Ishvara to raise them. But for a person deeply interested in the entire journey from lower to upper, we can talk about all of the above. Krishna describes this entire journey, which is what makes Bhagavad Gita so comprehensive and universal, because it covers so many topics like no other text. Of course, everything is discussed in brief, which perhaps means that Arjuna already knew of these things from previous education. But Krishna revisits them in a sequential manner and lets Arjuna make a choice. And so, this journey from lower to upper is the essence of the second chapter. It is a bird's eye view of much of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, we have to remember that the transcendental state combines the best of the three lower states and rejects the worst of the same three states. For instance, a tamasic person may be lazy, but he might superficially appear to be very humble. Similarly, a rajasic person may be very energized, but he may also be very arrogant. Likewise, a sattvic person may be detached, but he doesn't go beyond the call of duty. And so the transcending states combines the best and rejects the worst. It means that in the transcending state, a person is humble, energized, and detached at once. His humility is that he doesn't work for material benefits. His energetic state is that he works for his spiritual benefits. And his detachment is that he is not bothered about what others say about his lack of material motivation or his focus on the spiritual purpose. Another hallmark of this journey is that while going from a previous step to the next step, there is often an inversion of attitudes. For example, a tamasic person is lazy while a rajasic person is ambitious. So, as one goes from lazy to ambitious, there is an inversion. Then, a sattvic person is detached. So, in going from ambitious to detached, there is another inversion. Although detached is not lazy, so it is not a reversal to the tamasic stage. Finally, in going from sattvic to transcendent, there is another inversion of detachment from material matters to engagement in spiritual matters. So in each transition, there are inversions from an external viewpoint. Initially from depressed to ambitious, then from ambitious to detached, and then from detached to engaged. And due to these inversions, it can appear that a depressed person is detached or that a transcending person is ambitious. This is a cause of enormous confusion if we look only at selective things from an external viewpoint while neglecting other things. For instance, a depressed person neglects their duties, but a detached person does not. And so, even as a detached person seems withdrawn, he is not depressed. Likewise, a transcending person works for a spiritual purpose, but neglects works for a material purpose. And so, even as he looks engaged, he is not materially ambitious. And so, detachment can look like depression, and engagement can look like ambition, but they are not. We have to look at all the traits to understand which specific type of state they are in. One final point about guna before we dive into the specifics of the chapter. All of the above four states are opposed to each other in one sense and similar to the others in another sense. For instance, both tamasic and rajasic persons are materialistic, but the tamasic person wants results without working and the rajasic person works for the results. Similarly, the sattvic and rajasic states are materialistic, but the Rajasic person seeks happiness externally while a Sattvic person seeks happiness internally. Likewise, both Sattvic and Transcendent person seek happiness internally, but the Transcendent person goes beyond the call of duty to assist others, while a Sattvic person restricts himself to his duties. And so in all of these states, we can find some commonality with the other states and some opposition. Due to the presence of both commonality and opposition, we cannot use binary logic for these states because in binary logic, two things are either the same or mutually opposed. This is why in the first video in the series, we talked about the rejection of binary logic to understand guna. Guna is a ladder in which the higher rung looks like the lower rung in some ways and different from the lower rung in other ways. But the similarity and difference are only from an external perspective. From an internal perspective, they are completely different. And so a depressed emotional state is not the detached emotional state. And the ambitious emotional state is not the steadfast emotional state. And yet a depressed person can exhibit a behavior similar to a detached person. And similarly, an ambitious person can exhibit a behavior similar to the engaged person. This is how lazy people sometimes appear as enlightened and ambitious people sometimes appear to be transcendental. This appearance of similarity is external, but the experience of the internal state is completely different. And so those who have experienced the internal state can easily judge what guna a person is in. And those who haven't experienced the internal state can also judge by comparing all the traits, but that is slightly harder. As an example, a detached person may often ponder his death, but to someone unfamiliar with his inner state, it may look like depression, because depressed people also contemplate suicide. However, the detached person is not contemplating suicide. He is actually thinking of a wonderful life after the current body's death. But to one who doesn't know about the inversions, thinking about death seems tamasic rather than sattvic. Similarly, a transcendent person ponders expansion of the Lord's glories, and to someone unfamiliar with this inner state, it looks like personal ambition because he doesn't know about the inversions. And talking about expansion seems rajasic rather than transcendent. So, guna are sometimes difficult to understand if we are accustomed to binary logic and we just see one similarity and conclude that they are the same, or if we just see one opposition and we think they are higher when they could also be lower, or vice versa. To cite some extreme examples of these inversions, in the Bhagavad Purana we find stories of Jada Bharat and Lord Rishabdev, who walk the world like madmen. They don't even take bath or dress in clean clothes. Jad Bharat in fact looks like a lazy and crazy man. Similarly, Lord Rishabdev rolls in his own urine and stool. And so ordinary people think that they are tamasic individuals unfit to live in a civilized society. And yet they are in the highest state of self-realization. And so the highest state can sometimes look like the lowest state and vice versa. But if we hear them speak, then we immediately know that they are in the highest state of life and not in any of the lower levels. Therefore, it can be hard for everyone to judge who is in which condition. As the saying goes, appearances can be deceptive. That is because we generally imagine what we would be if we had that kind of appearance. But our imagination may not be the actual reality. In the first video in this series entitled The Science of Bhagavad-Gita, we talked about how causal time controls the jiva like a puppet. We discussed how Kala is called Pashupati because he drags the jiva like a master drags an animal. However, we also discussed that the jiva can stop this dragging by Kala just like an animal resisting the dragging by the animal's master. And so agreeing to be dragged by Kala makes the jiva think that it has no free will or choice. But choice exists if the jiva decides to exercise it by resisting the dragging. Of course, when we try to stop this dragging, the animal's master may tug harder, and sometimes we may even succumb to it. And so it takes practice and effort to realize that we always have free will, although we often don't use it. The tamasic stage is where we never resist the dragging by Kala, and we always feel that we have no free will. In the Rajasic state, that feeling is lesser, in the Sattvic stage, even lesser, and in the transcendent stage, it completely disappears. And so in Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 2, and verse 21, states the following: Vidyate hriday granthis, chidyante sarva sanchaya, shiyante chasya karmani, drashtra evatmanishware. It means that once a person is liberated, the knot in the heart, which are the guna that tie the Atma, and are the rope by which Pachupati pulls the Atma, are cut to pieces. All the doubts and misgivings, such as the one that Arjuna is having right now, are destroyed. All the apparent circumstantial limitations created by karma cease, and then the soul sees itself as the master. Drashta evatmanishware. That means the soul realizes that it is the controller and master of its own destiny. Of course, the Atma is not the master and controller of everyone's destiny, but it is the master and controller of its own destiny. Hence, there is a difference between Jiva as an Ishvara and the Lord as the Param Ishvara. So, when one realizes that he is a master and controller of his destiny, that is the full realization of one's free will. Without this realization, one thinks that he is constrained by his circumstances or the body and mind. But in lower stages, this realization is lesser and lesser, and in the tamasic stage, it is the least. And so, a person who says that he has no free will should be understood to be a person completely in the tamasic stage. When a person enters the tamasic stage, he often starts neglecting his duties. He sees no profit in doing anything. He doesn't want to do anything unless there is a profit. And he has no sense of the transcendent stage in which a person works spontaneously due to inner joy. And so Krishna tries to lift Arjuna by bringing him out of the tamasic stage of duty neglect to the rajasic state of duty performance for profit. Krishna says, "You are not acting like an Arya. You will not go to Swarga or heaven, and instead you will inherit infamy." Then Krishna sees that Arjuna is still inactive. So he provokes him further by calling him petty, impotent, and weak. But Krishna also tells Arjuna that he is the chastiser of enemies. So this pettiness, impotence, and weakness are not his actual nature, but he is currently overwhelmed by these temporarily. And so Krishna uses a carrot and stick method on Arjuna. The carrot is that he's a great warrior, and the stick is that if he doesn't fight, then by his pettiness, impotence, and weakness, he will lose his Arya heritage, he will inherit infamy by his actions, and he will miss going to Swarga. So, all these are materialistic arguments, and yet Krishna uses them on Arjuna because matter is not just one thing. Rather, Prakriti has three qualities of tamas, rajas, and sattva. So if someone is overcome by tamas, then we can use a rajasic argument. Everyone has heard of the phrase falling in love. Hardly anyone uses the phrase rising in love. Similarly, we have heard of the phrase love is blind, but nobody uses the phrase love is light. Likewise, people use the phrase madly in love, but nobody uses the phrase wisely in love. That is because love in this world becomes blind to the truth and makes us mad, and then we fall from duty. The love of Krishna is the opposite. So it is not falling in love but rising in love. It is not love is blind but love is light. And it is not madly in love but it is wisely in love. Because Krishna is truly worthy of love. And when we love him, we rise, we see the truth, and we become wise. And yet, both mundane and transcendental attachments are called love. And so people mistake bhakti with worldly love. They are not the same, but as we have discussed, the topmost level can look like the bottommost level and vice versa in some ways, but not in other ways. And so Arjuna has fallen in love, become blind, and all his arguments are those of a madman. And yet, this sentimentality looks comforting, relaxing, and pleasing to those in the tamasic stage. And that's why Krishna uses a Rajasic argument on him, telling him to become an Arya, fight the just war, not just for worldly prestige, but also for ascent to heavenly planets. That is the destruction of mundane love for family, and yet it is progress. So when people say that God is love, they may not understand that it is not love for humans, but love of God, which may sometimes include war because God is truth and virtue, while humans may be untruthful and unvirtuous. And so, fighting for truth and virtue is love of God, although it may seem that it is destruction of love for humans. Dharma is a difficult subject because it changes with person, time, place, and situation. We cannot prescribe universal rules or regulations. For instance, a universal rule may say that we should not wage war, but that would mean we should also not defend ourselves against attackers. Or a universal rule may say that we must always wage war, and that would mean we should attack everyone. It doesn't matter how many conditions we add to the universal rule, there will always be exceptions in which that rule should not be applied. Therefore, the simplest definition of dharma is greatest good, which means good for the greatest number of people, for the greatest number of times, places, and situations. But to decide the greatest good, we must know what brings the greatest good for the greatest number of people, times, places, and situations. That is not always easy to know, which is why it is said, Dharmam tu sakshat bhagavat pranitam, which means dharma is that which is prescribed by Bhagavan. But most people misunderstand this statement and think that if my scripture says that God asked us to kill everyone who doesn't believe in my religion, then killing everyone outside my religion is my God prescribed duty. So we must also ask, do God's prescriptions lead to the greatest good? And once we know the answer, then dharma is also rational. However, a blind faith in some religion is not. In this case, Arjuna thinks that protecting his family is his dharma, but Krishna wants him to fight and kill his family. That is called dharma sankat, or inability to decide what our duty actually is. When this confusion arises, we must approach a guru and ask them what our duty is. That asking also involves them explaining how it is the greatest good. And so, after arguing with Krishna, defending his position several times, Arjuna is internally miserable and unhappy because he knows something is wrong and yet he doesn't know what that actually is. He makes many arguments, but he actually doesn't believe in them. This disbelief in one's arguments is the result of the Paramatma in the heart, whom people call the inner voice or conscience. The Paramatma tells us when we are going wrong if we listen to his guidance. And so, those who have silenced the inner voice through repeated neglect feel very confident of their arguments. But those who listen to the inner voice don't feel confident even after making persuasive arguments. So, this dilemma, despite persuasive arguments, is due to Paramatma. And so Arjuna tells Krishna, now I have become imbued with the fault of miserliness. Miserly means I cannot think beyond my immediate situation. The devotees of the Lord are not miserly, which means they see the world as the Lord sees it. Since the Lord sees everything, so by taking shelter of the Lord, they also think of the greatest good. But those who only see the immediate situation can only think about a limited immediate good. So this limited vision is called Karpanya dosha. And Arjuna accepts that he is not imbued with this fault and asks Krishna to teach him dharma. The sincere desire to know dharma is the acceptance of a guru. Simply by saying, Shishyasteham sadhimam tvam prapannam, Arjuna becomes a disciple. Krishna doesn't perform a ritual to initiate Arjuna because these rituals are just a formality. The real thing is humbly asking the Guru about dharma and then following it. Simply doing a ritual for initiation and then disobeying the Guru is not initiation. But these days, people do an initiation ritual for show and then they don't inquire about dharma, or even if their dharma is told to them, they do whatever comes to their mind. Since the disciples are like that, so the gurus are also like that. The gurus also do rituals, don't teach dharma, and say whatever comes to their mind. And so these gurus and disciples are made for each other. The Lord arranges a sincere guru for a sincere disciple, and for the insincere disciple, he arranges an insincere guru. That is because the Lord is tit for tat. If we want a guru who will coddle our ego and placate our feelings, then we get a guru who says whatever helps him get more disciples. But if there is a sincere disciple, then the Paramatma guides him to a perfect guru. One final point about miserliness. As we rise in the ladder from tamas to rajas to sattva to transcendent, our consciousness expands. And the symptom of that expansion is that we can think about the greater and greater good until we come to the point where we can think of the greatest good. Conversely, as we fall from transcendent to sattva to rajas to tamas, our consciousness narrows. And the symptom of that narrowing is that our idea of good narrows progressively until we come to the bottommost stage of individualism, where we just think about our individual good. So, miserliness means narrow mindedness, and charitableness is broad mindedness. This broad minded person is called Mahatma or a great soul. It's not that the soul has expanded in size to become great, but his consciousness has expanded to think of the greatest good. Otherwise, one who only thinks about himself is called a Duratma, and Duryodhan is a Duratma. In Bhagavad-Gita chapter 9 verse 13, Krishna says, Mahatmanastu mam partha daivim prakritim ashritaha. It means that Mahatma is one who has taken shelter of Daivi Prakriti. So unless one has realized this Daivi Prakriti, he cannot be called a Mahatma or a broad-minded person because he will never do the greatest good. But in India, some people manufactured their own sentimental mythology, such as non-violence, and yet they were called Mahatma. They undermined those who were fighting the dharmic war and supported adharma for the illusion of peace. And the long-term result was even greater violence. So anyone who wants to avoid these disasters should do what Arjuna does, namely, become a disciple of Bhagavad Gita and take the instructions seriously. Simply inventing one's sentimental mythologies contrary to Bhagavad-Gita, and engaging in virtue signaling doesn't make someone a Mahatma. In fact, it causes far worse problems. And so, the moment Arjuna surrenders to Krishna, Krishna begins teaching him about the self or the Atma. The self is eternal and yet it goes from body to body. As we have discussed earlier, the self is I or the person, and the body is the attributes of I. So, for example, people say that I am a child, I am youth, I am old, I am Indian, I am American, I am black, I am white, I am brown, etc. So, whatever follows the I is an attribute of the I, and that is the body. Likewise, as we have discussed, these attributes are not fixed. They are ever changing in the material world. And this change of attribute is the I going from one body to another. Now, most people think that the soul moves to another body only at the time of death. This is a monotheistic conception of transmigration of the soul, and it is rejected at the beginning of Bhagavad Gita. Instead, Krishna says that we are transmigrating at every moment of life through a new attachment between a person and a property. And so, if we take the monotheistic conception, then transmigration is a great mystery. But if we take the Bhagavad Gita conception, then transmigration is very easy to understand. And so, Krishna says, Dehino asmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara tatha dehantara praptir dhiras tatra namuhyati. Note the two words yatha and tatha. Yatha means just as, and tatha means in the same way. So, just as we are constantly changing bodies in this life, similarly, at the time of death, we will change our body again. But before we can accept that we will change a body after death, we have to know that we existed in the past, we exist in the present, and we will exist in the future. So, this eternity of the Atma comes before the transmigration. By the eternity itself, we know that we are not the body, although the body is a temporary attribute of the Atma. And then we also know that these attributes are continuously changing at every moment. And so one might ask, what is the mechanism of body change? And Krishna gives the answer by saying, Dehino asmin yatha dehe. Dehina means the person who has a body, and Dehe means within the body or inside the body. For those who know Sanskrit, Dehe is the seventh declension of Deha, which means inside or within the Deha or body. So this means there is a body and the Atma is moving inside the body, and this movement of the Atma inside the body is going from childhood to youth to old age. So now people may ask, does it mean consciousness goes from head to hands to belly to legs throughout life? Is that what is causing the aging of the body? The answer is no. Deha is a collection of bodies that include child body, youth body, and old body. Even the future bodies exist right now. Even the past bodies exist right now. And yet, as we have discussed, Prakriti goes manifest and unmanifest. So the past and future are hidden and the present is revealed. I gave this example of a person pulling out balls from a bag earlier. Suppose you have a bag of various colored balls, such as red, blue, green, yellow, etc. And you pull out one ball from the bag, look at it, and then get bored with it. Then you put that ball in the bag and pull out the next ball. Again, you get bored by looking at it and you put it inside the bag and pull out another one. And in this way, life goes from one step to another. Now, when you become old, then we might say, oh, I want the childhood ball back. And if that desire exists, then nature gives us a new bag of balls. So the Atma moving inside the Deha doesn't mean consciousness is moving from head to toe. It means going from one body to another and changing the attributes of the self to enjoy something new. In the Vedic text, we find the stories of creation by Brahma. Initially, Brahma creates the four Kumaras, namely Sanak, Sanandan, Sanatan, and Sanat Kumar, and asks them to populate the universe. But these Kumaras refuse to create and they say that we will not grow up and simply remain 4-year-old boys. Even they can grow up into adults, but they choose not to. Then Brahma creates Narad and asks him to populate the universe. And even Narad refused to create, even though he is youthful. So he stays youthful and never becomes old and lives as long as Brahma. And so they have a material body, but they don't become old. Meanwhile, Brahma becomes old. So we have to ask, how do we become old? And why do some individuals don't become old? And the answer is that child, youth, and old bodies are created as potentials at the time of birth. And the soul moves in this bag of potentials one by one. But someone can choose not to move. That is possible if we are not bored, tired, frustrated, unhappy. If we are blissful with whatever we are, then we remain in the present and our body becomes eternal. The four Kumaras and Narad are blissful like that. But Brahma is not so blissful. And so the four Kumara and Narad never become old. Meanwhile, their father, Brahma, gradually becomes old, although it is very slow. Similarly, we read in the Vedic text that in Satya Yuga, people live for tens of thousands of years, which gradually reduces over the subsequent Yuga, and toward the end of Kali Yuga, the lifetime reduces to just 20 or 25 years. That is because in Satya Yuga, people are far more blissful and not frustrated, unhappy, bored, and tired. Likewise, we read in the Vedic text that the Devas or demigods live for 36,000 years, even in Kali Yuga. Meanwhile, the lifetime on earth is barely 80 years. That is because they are quite blissful and not tired, bored, frustrated, and unhappy. Similarly, yogis can live for hundreds of years because they remain very blissful. And so, simply by becoming blissful, our lifespan increases. But as we become more and more frustrated, the more change we want and the faster we die. These days, we see people who are barely 40 or 50, but their skin has become wrinkled and they keep pumping their bodies with vitamins and other types of chemicals. So, how do we stay blissful? And the answer is that the Atma is eternal, and this change of body can be stopped or slowed or accelerated simply by the Atma. Of course, when the karma of this life is over, then Kala or causal time and Prakriti or material nature forcibly moves the Atma to a new body. And so we must have good karma to live a long life. But karma is just like money. We can spend it slowly or we can spend it quickly. When we live a life of simple living and high thinking, then that karma is spent slowly. And if we reverse it into simple thinking and high living, then we spend it fast. And so everyone can elongate their lives within certain limits of karma, kala, and prakriti. And that is because all these bodies are just like balls in a bag. We pull them out one by one, and we can slow that pulling out or speed it up. This collection of bodies is called Deha, and the Atma moves within this Deha. And upon death, the Atma moves into a new collection of bodies. And so Krishna says, just like we are moving from body to body in one collection, similarly we will move to another collection. So there is no need to be bewildered by the occasion of death. When I was in the last year of my college, I did a course in nonlinear dynamics. And the peculiarities of nonlinear dynamics are useful to understand how the Atma goes around in one body and then jumps to a new body. The hallmark of nonlinear dynamics is that a particle never repeats its previous state exactly, although it can come very close to the previous state. The particle goes round and round in a closed region of space, which is called an attractor. An attractor is a collection of states, just like our life is a collection of states like childhood, youth, and old age. So the nonlinear particle goes around inside the attractor, never repeating the past state, and that is called chaotic dynamics or nonlinear dynamics. Then suddenly it jumps from one attractor into another and again starts going round and round inside that attractor. And sometimes it can jump back to the previous attractor or it can jump into a new attractor. And so those who know nonlinear dynamics can use this as an example of how the Atma moves within one body and then from one body to another. The Atma is a particle and the bodies are the attractors. The particle goes around in one attractor and then jumps into another attractor. Of course, nonlinear dynamics is based on mathematics and the Atma's movement is based on choices. So this is not a precise or perfect analogy, but one can use it as a loose analogy of soul motion. The precise analogy comes in Bhagavad-Gita in the 13th chapter, where we see Krishna talking about Kshetra and Kshetrajna. There Krishna says that Kshetra or field is the body and Atma is the Kshetrajna or the knower of this field. So the same topic will come up again and I don't want to preempt that right now. But it is important to mention that here to make the point that the body is not one thing but a field of many states. Just like a person may walk in a garden and see different flowers one by one, and each time the Atma identifies with the flower and says, now I am a rose, now I am a marigold, and now I am a lily. And so modern science tries to describe how a rose becomes a marigold and then how a marigold becomes a lily, which is a total illusion. The rose doesn't become marigold and the marigold doesn't become lily. Rather, rose, marigold, and lily are flowers in a garden. And the person walking in the garden identifies with these things and says that I am a rose, marigold, and lily. So neither is the self changing nor is the rose becoming marigold or lily. Only the connection between the self and the flowers are changing. And like Atma walks in one garden right now, similarly it will be put into another garden after death. And so we have to stop thinking how a rose becomes marigold and start thinking how an unchanging self identifies with a rose and marigold. The former is change of body itself, and the latter is the soul changing bodies, while the bodies themselves remain unchanged but become invisible. After discussing the big picture of the Atma moving from one body to another, Krishna goes into the discussion of individual sensations, such as hot and cold, happiness and distress. Now, it's very important to understand that Krishna puts hot and cold in the same category as happiness and distress. Because in modern science, we think that hot and cold are objective realities, whereas happiness and distress are subjective realities. So, for example, one can measure hot and cold with a thermometer, but there is no emotion meter for measuring happiness and distress. But Krishna doesn't make that distinction. He puts hot and cold in the same category as happiness and distress. And he says that both of them arise due to matra sparshas, which means the touching of the tanmatra. In Sankhya, there are indriya or senses, and then there are tanmatra or sensations like hot and cold, pleasure and pain. And these sensations come out of the senses and then merge back into the senses. And that emergence and merger is called experience. In this verse, Krishna calls the emergence agama, which means arrival, and the merger apaina, which means vanishing. So hot and cold come out of the senses and then dissolve back into the senses. And Krishna says that this emergence and merger is anitya or temporary and asks Arjuna to tolerate both. To understand these things in a modern context, I will use a little bit of quantum mechanics. I will keep it simple and non-technical so everyone can understand. In quantum mechanics, there is a possibility field called the wave function. And on this possibility field, an operator acts to produce something from the field. These operators are called energy, momentum, angular momentum, and spin operators. And when this operator acts, something pops out of the wave function and then pops back in. That momentary popping out and popping in is called an observation. The fundamental problem in understanding this popping out and popping in is that scientists keep thinking that it pertains to some external reality. Because modern science was created as the study of some external world. And by definition, science was never going to study the observer, their senses, their mind, and so on. But in quantum mechanics, due to this momentary popping, there is no objective reality. And that troubles scientists a lot. The most troubled of these scientists was Einstein, because he firmly believed that an objective external reality exists, and he could not accept that reality appears and disappears. And so Einstein would discuss these problems with his academic colleagues, such as Niels Bohr, and then even a little bit with Indian philosophers such as Rabindranath Tagore. In these discussions, he would always come to the same question, namely, if we are not seeing something, then does it really exist? Even in India, there is a proverb that says, if a peacock danced in the forest, but nobody saw it, then did it really dance? And so Einstein would debate this question, thinking that science is studying objective reality. Meanwhile, Niels Bohr had the opposite view of quantum mechanics. He would say that science is not about an external reality, but about our experiences, which in this case means our sensations like hot and cold. This debate went on for a long time, and it's called Bohr-Einstein debate today. The key question is quantum mechanics describing an objective reality or our subjective knowledge of reality? Now let's understand this verse in light of this controversial debate. Krishna is saying that sensations like hot and cold are created by the touching of tanmatra with the senses. He doesn't say what causes these tanmatra, but that comes later in this chapter where Krishna says that our senses are like the limbs of a tortoise that move inward and outward. And when they move outward, then they interact with sense objects, and then sensations are created. And so there is a reality, but what we see is not always what the limbs of the tortoise touch, because our experience includes happiness and distress, but the limbs don't touch happiness and distress. Likewise, someone may feel very hot or very cold, and someone may feel less hot and cold. And so there is an external world, but what we know about the external world is not objective truth. It is rather created by the combination of the external and internal, and even this creation is momentary and fleeting. And so both Einstein and Bohr were right in one sense and wrong in another sense. Bohr was right in saying that our knowledge is about our sensations, so it is not objective reality. Einstein was right in saying that there must be an objective reality even if we don't observe it. And this bridge between subjective and objective requires some interaction between the observer and reality, which is called the mind body problem. Namely, we don't know what causes this interaction. The problem in the mind-body interaction is that the objective can interact with the subjective only if the subjective is like the objective, or vice versa. If they are completely different, then they cannot interact. And Krishna solves this problem by saying that the senses move inward and outward to interact with sense objects. But these sense objects are not physical particles. They are like containers, and the senses are like the liquid we pour into the container. So when the liquid is poured, the liquid takes the form of the container. And so by the interaction of senses and sense objects, a form is created, which is called tanamatra, and then the senses perceive it for a moment. And so even as sense objects are different from the senses, their interaction produces a form and perception. But it is created by the senses moving inward and outward, not due to mechanical forces. However, neither Bohr nor Einstein suggest that senses and mind are active, because this subjective movement is not governed by a mathematical equation. Factually, if an observation is caused by a subjective movement, then that would be the end of modern science, which fully relies on mathematical equations to describe our experiences. Since our senses and minds don't move based on an equation, therefore this mind-body interaction process is rejected. And so an easily solvable problem has been debated for a century because the actual solution is unacceptable. As we previously discussed, the Atma is moving through a kshetra or field, but the field is not moving. In the last video, I talked about how the Atma is moving and the body is not moving because the body is the field. But nearly everyone at present, including scientists like Einstein and Bohr, think that the body is moving while the observer is stationary. And so this is the central problem of inversion, in which science says that the body is moving and the soul is stationary. But Bhagavad-Gita says that the soul is moving and the body is stationary. And this is why we can't understand Bhagavad-Gita transmigration of the soul unless we stop attributing causality to matter and start assigning causality to the observer. The problem is that the observer's movement is not mathematical, and so nobody wants to talk about it. Therefore, quantum mechanics says particles pop out and pop in, where they think that these particles are objective realities rather than subjective sensations. With this explanation of perception, Krishna urges Arjuna to remain undisturbed by hot and cold, happiness and distress, knowing these to not be the Atma's properties, but the properties of the senses and the sense objects. Krishna describes this undisturbed condition as liberation. In the liberated state, the Atma isn't attracted to something just because the senses find it pleasing. And the Atma isn't repelled against something just because the senses find it displeasing. Rather, the Atma does his duty regardless of pleasing or displeasing. That can only happen if we are equally disposed towards hot and cold, happiness and distress. So the preliminary step is to say that hot and cold or happiness and distress are separate from the Atma and then remain equipoised in both. After discussing the temporary nature of hot and cold, happiness and distress, Krishna makes a very important statement which literally nobody at present understands. Krishna says that whatever is temporary is unreal and only the eternal is real. This is absolutely the inversion of how most people think. For example, if you look at a table and chair, then you will say that these are reality or they exist. But we also know that table and chair are not eternal. So Krishna says that these are unreal because they don't persist, and the self, which persists forever, is real. But everyone thinks that table and chair are real and the self may be unreal. Based on this verse, impersonalists say that the world doesn't exist because Krishna calls it unreal. Conversely, materialists say that the world exists, so it cannot be an illusion. But the Atma doesn't exist, and so the world keeps changing according to some mathematical laws, and yet even this changing world is factually reality. Both of these positions are false because they arise out of thinking of the world as objects or things or substances rather than potentials. As we have discussed, Prakriti is potentials, which are manifest or unmanifest. Even if our childhood body has become unmanifest during our adult life, it hasn't ceased to exist. And sometimes in a dream, we may see that we are a child. And so the child body exists right now, and yet it is unmanifest. And Krishna calls that asat or unreal. Meanwhile, the Atma never becomes unmanifest, and Krishna calls that Sat or real. And so the world is neither the reality of the materialist nor the illusion of the impersonalist. These two positions are called realism and idealism in Western philosophy, and both are wrong. But because these are the only two alternatives offered in Western thinking, therefore, if we say that the world is unreal, then everyone thinks it must be an illusion. Or if we say that the world exists, then everyone thinks that it must be a reality. And so many centuries have been spent just discussing whether the world is real or unreal under the false assumptions about reality and unreality. This verse clarifies that reality is not that which exists, but that which persists. And unreality is not that which is our illusion, but that which is temporary. And so the world is unreal, not in the sense that it doesn't exist, but in the sense that it is temporary. Words like truth and reality, therefore, have a completely different meaning in Western and Vedic terminologies. And so, when the Vedic texts state that the world is unreal, a Western or modern interpreter thinks that it is simply a hallucination. But if we say that the world is real, then they think it must be material objects. Thus, when quantum mechanics was created, material objectivity collapsed. But under the false Western dualism of realism versus idealism, most people in the West began thinking that the world must be our hallucination. And so movies like The Matrix were made, in which people are living in a hallucination created by computers. This so called idealism is also materialism because there is a computer with hardware and software injecting images in our brain. And thus, the West has never been able to think beyond materialism. But they think that one type of materialism is idealism and another type of materialism is realism. That is because their idea of reality is physical stuff. But in the Bhagavad-Gita, there is no physical stuff. Rather, the world is potentials, which appear or disappear due to the movement of the Atma. But the Atma never appears or disappears. And so the moving Atma is real, but the field in which it is moving is unreal. Factually, that field or garden is created temporarily for our experience. And then that garden disappears as we move into a new garden. And so all the gardens exist for a short while, but the Atma exists eternally. After drawing one type of distinction between the Atma and the world, Krishna gives another example in which the consciousness pervades the entire body, so it is one thing and yet it is spread. Meanwhile, the body comprises many parts, which are distinct things, and they are not spread. So in a crude modern language, we could say that the body comprises particles or atoms, whereas the consciousness is like a wave or a field. Now, even if we cut a body part, the consciousness shrinks to the remaining body parts. And so consciousness cannot be these body parts. In fact, since the consciousness survives the cutting of body parts, therefore it is indestructible. As we discussed in the first video, we are able to maintain marriage, property ownership, and credit for our past work only because a person's identity remains unchanged throughout their lives. Likewise, as the consciousness expands to the entire body, even as the body expands, so we cannot assign a fixed size to that consciousness, and therefore it is immeasurable. Therefore, Krishna calls the Atma or consciousness both immeasurable and imperishable due to separation from the body. For many centuries now, the Western world has believed that the soul exists in a fixed part of the body. For example, Descartes, who created the mind-body dualism, believed that the soul exists in a pineal gland in the brain. The West has also believed that neural impulses bring information from all over the body into this central place, whatever that may be. But there is a serious problem, namely that the neural impulses are simply molecules which don't carry the address of the place they are bringing sensations from. So, for example, if you receive an email, then the email has a sender's address on it. But molecules don't have a sender's address. So, if your hand is itching, some part of the brain may get a molecule from the itching hand, but the brain cannot know that it is coming from the hand. Therefore, the brain has no way of knowing that the hand is itching instead of the legs, because it is receiving letters that don't have a sender's address. Similarly, even for these molecules to move, something must drive their motion. But in quantum mechanics, matter exists in stationary states, and even when it pops out or in, it is due to the action of some consciousness. And so, for my hand to itch, something must activate a potential in the hand, and that is not matter. Then, for me to receive information about an itch, the molecules in stationary states must move, and the cause of that also cannot be matter. And so there is no scenario in which we can explain consciousness of the body if that consciousness has a seat in the body and is not spread all over the body. However, if the consciousness spreads all over the body and if matter is semantic, then molecules can carry a sender's address, and then the seat of the soul can know that the hand is itching. Because consciousness will activate the potentials, and these potentials are like emails moving in the body, carrying the senders and receivers' addresses. Conversely, if consciousness doesn't spread, then molecules are always in a stationary state, and they carry no sender's or receiver's address. And therefore, we can never know that the hand is itching or where the molecules have to go. And so this theory that consciousness is sitting in some part of the body has no explanatory power, because we have to explain how an itch is created, how it is transferred to the seat of the soul, and the soul knows where it is itching. To do that, the soul must be both a particle and a field, which means that it is one individual and yet it spreads its consciousness. This particle and field is known by the tripartite nature of the soul, called Sat Chit Anand. And this Chit is in one place like a particle, and Sat or the consciousness spreads like a field, and Anand is the will that decides where it spreads and why. And when it spreads due to will, we seek out a specific target, such as the hand. And when we get the sensation of the hand, we know it is the hand itching. Again, just like the tortoise moving its limbs inward and outward, The consciousness spreads in and out from one place. However, matter doesn't spread like this. Our hand is just where the hand is, not where the legs are. But the Atma is in one place and it spreads because of its tripartite nature called Satchitanand. And this spreading makes the Atma immeasurable because it can spread infinitely. Similarly, for something to kill the Atma, another Atma is required because only that Atma can activate the material potential which will move the hand which might kill. And so matter itself cannot kill the Atma. Only one Atma can kill another Atma. But before one Atma can kill another Atma, it must penetrate the other Atma. But at the point of penetration, the two Atma become the same Atma. So the proposal must be that one Atma must kill itself. That proposal involves asking, how can something conscious become unconscious? And the answer is that the Atma can go to sleep. One Atma can even put another Atma to sleep, provided it itself goes to sleep in the process. This is what happens when the universal creation is withdrawn, as Lord Mahavishnu goes to sleep, and that puts all the Atma to sleep. So sleeping is the best we can do while trying to kill the Atma. This is why Buddhists talk about Anatmavad, which means no self, and they enter deep sleep in which there is no consciousness. But the Atma is not actually dead. A person put into deep sleep can awaken again. And so, whoever tries to kill the Atma himself goes to sleep without killing anyone else. With this background, we can understand how the Atma is indestructible and immeasurable. It is immeasurable because consciousness can spread infinitely. And it is indestructible because any attempt to end consciousness makes it unconscious and puts it to sleep. Factually, even Prakriti is also immeasurable and indestructible because Prakriti can expand infinitely, and any attempt to destroy anything in Prakriti simply makes it unmanifest, which is the sleeping state of one part of Prakriti. So both Atma and Prakriti are immeasurable and indestructible. But Krishna talks about the Deha or the body here and says that these bodies will perish, which is their state in which they become unmanifest. The difference is that we cannot manifest the unmanifest body, but we can awaken ourselves if we are sleeping. So, although both are sleeping, the body is said to be destroyed because we don't have control over the manifestation of the body, although Prakriti does. Since consciousness is immeasurable, therefore there can be no mathematical theory of consciousness. Because to do mathematics, we must get a fixed measurement. So someone can now argue that the Atma is described as 1 by 10,000th part of the tip of the hair. So that is a measurement. How can we say that consciousness is immeasurable when a measurement has already been given? And the answer is that Atma is both finite and infinite, just like an idea. For example, the word color is finite, but the meaning of color is infinite shades. And so we can grasp the word color in a moment, but nobody can grasp all the infinite shades. Similarly, Krishna is finite because we can chant the name Krishna in a moment. But the meaning of Krishna is infinite because Krishna means all attractive, and there are infinite ways in which he attracts infinite living entities, which we can never grasp. And so, to understand how the Atma is both finite and infinite, we have to know word meaning philosophy. That finite word like Atma is situated in the heart, and the infinite meaning like consciousness spreads all over the body. Like that, Krishna lives like the word in Goloka, and yet, as the meaning, his consciousness spreads over his entire creation. And so, just because a size of the Atma is mentioned doesn't make it finite, because that size pertains to the word, not the meaning. Therefore, if we want, we can create a computer program with a variable called Atma or consciousness. But that is not going to make the computer conscious because it is just a meaningless word. Adding meaning to the word requires us to reject the entire materialistic paradigm that began by separating meaning and purpose from the material realm. With the word meaning philosophy, we can understand what people call wave particle duality in quantum mechanics. The word is like a particle and the meaning is like a field or wave. The word is finite and the meaning is infinite. Even the soul follows wave particle duality because the soul has a seat in the heart, so it is like a finite particle. And yet the consciousness of the soul spreads all over the body, so that is like an infinite field. Likewise, Krishna lives in Goloka, so he is like a particle. But his consciousness spreads all over the numerous universes, so that is like a field. Finally, since the consciousness spreads in the entire body, therefore by the consciousness the soul is immanent in the body. But the particle from where the consciousness expands is transcendent to the body. In fact, if the body is destroyed, the consciousness contracts back into the particle like soul and then expands into a new body like a field. Similarly, during sleep or a serious accident, a person loses consciousness, although he doesn't die. That is because the consciousness contracts during sleep or accident and then spreads when the person wakes up or regains consciousness. When Krishna says that the Atma is immeasurable, he is talking about the expanding field of consciousness. And when he says that the Atma is indestructible, he is talking about the particle like soul. And so, by understanding word meaning philosophy and wave particle science, we can understand the indestructible and the immeasurable soul. Whether by philosophy or by science or by lived experience, we can understand this paradigm of one thing being opposite things, such as wave and particle, word and meaning, finite and infinite, immanent and transcendent, contracted and expanded. Over the next several verses, Krishna repeats the same message in different ways. For instance, he gives the specific example that the Atma cannot be cut by weapons, burned by fire, dried by air, or wetted by water. That is because in the Mahabharata war, four kinds of weapons are used. The first kind is the ordinary weapons like spears, swords, and arrows. They cut a body into pieces. Then there are three kinds of weapons called the weapon of fire, water, and air. The weapon of fire causes a body to burst into flames. The weapon of water causes the body to die by freezing. The weapon of air causes the body to disintegrate like dust particles. Fire, water, and air are called Pitta, Kapha, and Vata in Ayurveda. And a living body balances these three. But if one of them increases, then the body becomes sick. And if that increase goes beyond a point, then the body dies. So the weapon of fire, water, and air increase the Pitta, Kapha, and Vata to bring death. So after noting all the ways that the body can die, Krishna says that the Atma is never born and never dies. That is just like we can break a specific table into pieces, but by that breaking, we cannot destroy the idea. That is because the body is like word and the Atma is like meaning. If we burn a book, the ideas are not burned. they just become inaccessible to most people. But the same ideas exist eternally and they can again manifest into another book. So, tearing the book, burning the book, drowning the book, or peeling the ink from the book doesn't kill the ideas manifest through the book. This fundamental difference between book and idea has never been understood in iconoclastic religions. They think that if they burn a book or break an image of a deity, they will kill the deity or kill the ideas. That is because iconoclastic religions are fundamentally materialistic. They don't have any conception of something that transcends the body. So they burn books and break the images, thinking that they have killed the ideas or the deities. But those deities and ideas are never killed. And so, as time passes, new books are written and new images are made. It is exactly like the resurrection after an apocalypse, when all the dead bodies come alive, except that it doesn't require an apocalypse. So, materialistic people can't understand how something transcends the body because they can't understand ideas. And therefore, they also cannot understand the Atma and how it is both finite and infinite, both transcendent and immanent, both alive and dead, and yet never born and never dying. This is why semanticism is so essential to take people out of their false dogmas that are fundamentally materialistic and yet pretend to be something spiritual. There are certain verses in which Krishna makes statements that would be generally unacceptable to many people at present. For example, he says that the soul is avyakta or unmanifest, and therefore it is invisible. Therefore, we have to understand that even Prakriti or nature is avyakta and therefore invisible. And that is why we talk about potentials in science. The unmanifest becomes manifest and then it is visible. But that doesn't mean it is always visible. Similarly, Krishna says that the Atma is achintya or inconceivable. Therefore, we have to understand word meaning philosophy and then we can understand how the Atma is both immanent and transcendent, both measurable and immeasurable. Then Krishna says that the Atma is avikara, which means never modified, and yet without ever changing its eternal nature, the consciousness of the Atma takes on various forms, such as humans, animals, birds, fishes, beasts, and reptiles. And yet it retains its eternal nature, just like one person, while watching a movie can imagine himself to be a hero or a villain, and during a dream he thinks he is being praised or criticized. But after the movie or the dream is over, the person realizes that all that was simply imagination or fiction, and his true identity outside the movie or the dream remains unchanged. Finally, Krishna says that the soul is amazing, and yet many people cannot understand this amazing Atma because opposite things are said about the Atma, such as finite and infinite, manifest and unmanifest, measurable and immeasurable, eternal and temporary, unmodified and modified. And so people may wonder, how can opposite things be true? Or is it a wonder that opposite things are true, but we cannot understand them? And so, spiritual understanding has often been drowned in mystique, and people have often accepted its mystery. However, that mystique works quite well only if there is trust between the student and the teacher. The student can say, I understand this much and no more. But because I trust the teacher, I will accept these contradictory claims for now, and over time I will understand how all of them are true. And so, in a trustworthy society, mystique doesn't create so many problems because over time one realizes that it is true. But if the trust in the society is gone due to deceit, lies, and falsehood, then mystique also loses its place. And then we have to explain how opposite things are true. It requires going as deep as rejecting binary logic in which only one side of the opposite could be true. But it also requires ordinary examples to understand how opposite things are true. And so the examples of word and meaning, or the idea table and its instance, are such examples. Through such examples, we make the mysterious rational. But it requires a lot of effort to discard the old ideas and take the new ideas. And so these scientific discussions on what is otherwise mysterious are for a time, place, situation, and people who have lost the trust in the Vedic texts. They may dismiss them as outdated, false, or contradictory. This problem did not exist earlier because the Vedic tradition was trusted. And so when the trust is gone, we cannot say something is inconceivable or amazing but not understood or unmanifest, etc. We have to explain all these words in a way that people can understand them and then develop the trust. So these series of videos are simply about rebuilding the trust in things we may be currently dismissing. After describing the nature of the Atma, Krishna advises Arjuna to follow the path of dharma or duty in four distinct steps that we discussed at the beginning of this chapter and video. These are the steps of the three guna, namely tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic, and then transcendent. In the tamasic stage, a person is motivated by threats of punishment, loss, infamy, and suffering. We can collectively call them the motivation by the stick. From verse 33 to 36, Krishna describes how Arjuna will incur sins by neglecting his duty. His reputation will suffer, people will speak of him dishonorably, his enemies will consider him worthless, and many will even doubt his abilities. In short, they will not think that Arjuna backed out of the war due to compassion, but due to his incompetence. Then in verse 37 and 38, Krishna gives Arjuna a carrot, namely, that if Arjuna wins the war, then he will enjoy an earthly kingdom. But even if he loses the war, he will still ascend to heaven because he died fighting a dharmic war. Since the outcome is win-win in both cases, therefore there is no reason to not fight. So now Krishna is giving Arjuna a selfish incentive to fight. Now one might say that even Kauravas are fighting for a selfish motive. So what is the difference between the two? And the answer is that under Rajoguna, one does their duties with a desire for good results. Meanwhile, under Tamoguna, one either neglects their duties or does the opposite of their duties, desiring good results. So Kauravas are in Tamoguna because they are doing the opposite of their duties and neglecting their actual duty, hoping for good results. But if Arjuna fights, even hoping for good results, his war will be for the preservation of dharma. So even though both are fighting, and both may be fighting in their selfish interests, the fight for Arjuna is for the protection of dharma, and that of Kauravas is for the neglect and going against dharma. Arjuna is not swayed by the carrot and stick arguments, and he remains quiet. Therefore, Krishna now proceeds to speak about working without desiring any results, which we often call Karma Yoga. By this Karma Yoga, Krishna says that Arjuna will be freed from both good and bad karma. So it is a progress over the tamasic and rajasic states into the sattvic stage. Krishna now describes some traits of Karma Yoga which are illustrative. First, when we disregard the results of our actions, then we often incur losses. For example, we might speak the truth and offend many people, and they will then become our enemies, which is a loss. But Krishna says even if you see some superficial loss, there is actually no loss. Because the loss that you are seeing is the result of your previous actions and not the current actions. By your current actions, you are proceeding towards liberation, but there are still results of past actions to be borne. So don't worry about these losses. They will come in one way or another. And instead of thinking that your dharma is causing you losses, think about how these actions are taking you towards liberation. Second, Krishna warns Arjuna that this mood of just doing one's dharma and not thinking about gain and loss is not easy to keep. One might speak the truth once or twice, and then he may find that all his friends have left him alone, and now he is completely alone. And then, unable to bear the burden of loneliness, he may again start speaking pleasant lies because he wants to be with his friends rather than alone. And so, Krishna cautions Arjuna, those who go on this path of dharma must have a very resolute mind. It is easy to talk about dharma and very hard to stick to that path. As soon as we start on this path, most people abandon us, or they create many difficulties, or they may attack us outright, malign us, shame us, and try to push us off our path in many ways. And in these situations, our intelligence goes in many paths, which Krishna calls Bahushakhayanantascha buddhayo avyavasayinam. It means that the intelligence of the adharmic person is many branched because he is always calculating which path is going to give him the best results. Should I tell this lie to get this friend, or should I not speak the truth to get that friend? In this way, there are many branches in which the intellect goes trying to evaluate the pros and cons. But the dharmic person remains fixed because he doesn't calculate the pros and cons. In an earlier video, I had said that Krishna doesn't call Arjuna a Kuru ever, but that was an oversimplification. In this verse, Krishna calls Arjuna Kurunandana when he says, Vyavasayatmika buddhi ekeha Kurunandana. Hidden in this statement is the indication that Arjuna is unable to stay fixed in this path because Arjuna has been calculating the pros and cons of war, saying that if he fights, then he will lose his family, but then he is also depressed because of not fighting, perhaps due to the thinking that he will have to live in a forest for the rest of his their life. So this pro versus con battle has been raging in Arjuna's mind, and that's why Krishna calls Arjuna Kurunandana, which means someone like the Kauravas who think of gain and loss rather than duty. Third and finally, Krishna says that people who talk about going to heaven are men of very small knowledge. By this, he rejects the Rajasic path of fighting for gain and advocates fighting simply because it is a duty. And so, as far as the actions are concerned, both Rajasic and Sattvic people may do the same actions, but their mental state is completely different. The Rajasic person thinks about profit and loss, and so often doesn't do the duty that may lead to immediate loss. But the Sattvic person remains resolute in duty, even if that leads to many losses. So someone might say that you are doing things that lead to loss. But Krishna says these things are said by people of small intelligence because they see the short term gains and not the long term losses. Of course, at this juncture, Arjuna is not fully convinced about Karma Yoga because he cannot stop thinking about gain and loss. As we have discussed, Arjuna's mind is lamenting the potential loss of his family if he fights. So Krishna makes a very cutting statement, which is quite famous. He says, Karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. The word adhikar means rights and dharma means duties. And so Krishna says, your only right is your duties. It means that if someone stops you from doing your duty, you can fight for your duty because doing your duty is your right. But you don't have any other rights, such as to kingdom, family, love, etc. Then Krishna goes on to say, Ma karma phal hetrubhu, mati sangostu karmani. It means do not act thinking about the positive outcomes, such as winning a kingdom, and don't stop fighting simply because it will lead to a loss. So both statements are made because generally people do something thinking about the positive results and don't do other things because they bring negative results. And Krishna warns against both action and inaction based on notions of gain and loss. This verse destroys the very foundation of modern democratic societies rooted in the doctrine of rights. The West came up with a doctrine of rights such as right to free speech, the right to hold property, the right to choose your religion and ideology, the right to vote in elections, the right to an attorney, and so on. But all these rights are mistaken because they violate duties. For example, someone might tell lies and call it their right to free speech. That is adharma. We have no right to speech, but we have a duty to speak the truth. So, as long as we speak the truth, we are exercising our right to a duty. But we have no duty to tell lies. So, free speech in general cannot be a right. Similarly, we have no right to property because everything is ultimately God's property and it should be engaged in God's service, not in our personal service. And so, if we are engaging our property in God's service, then we have a right to our duty and we can hold the property. But we cannot simply hoard property and call it a right when it is not being used in God's service. And so, all these ideas of rights are simply mental fictions created by the Western society. Krishna says there is only one right, and that is a right to your duty. And we can defend that right to do the duty. But if it is not a duty, then we have no right, and defending those rights is adharma. The fact is that duties are necessary and sufficient to fulfill our rights, but rights are neither necessary nor sufficient to fulfill our duties. For example, we can say that we have a right to justice. But for us to get our justice, the police, the lawyers, and the judges must do their duties. If they do their duties, then we get our justice, and the right to justice is unnecessary. But if they don't do their duties, then we don't get our justice, and claiming that we have a right to justice is insufficient. So, when right to justice is neither necessary nor sufficient to get justice, then what good is that right? The fact is that in all these societies claiming to have rights, millions of people don't get justice and millions of people escape justice. And yet, everyone claims to have the right to justice. So, this de jure right is not de facto justice. However, if everyone does their duty, then we don't need to demand a right, and yet everyone gets justice without demanding a right. Therefore, duties are necessary and sufficient to fulfill all our rights, and rights are neither necessary nor sufficient to fulfill our duties. So, Krishna's statement when he says, you only have a right to do your duty, is 100% accurate. Demanding any other right without doing the duty is meaningless fiction. But of course, people create all these fictions like Bill of Rights and then realize that they don't get them. Finally, Krishna says that if you do your duties in this equipoised manner without thinking of gain and loss, then you are yogastha or situated in yoga. Now, in the previous videos, we have discussed how yoga is joining the parts of Ishvara to the whole Ishvara. But so far, Krishna has not discussed his nature and not asked Arjuna to do just as he says. That will come in the later parts of Bhagavad-Gita. So how can Krishna call this yoga when Ishvara has not been mentioned and no conception of joining of Ishvara and Jiva has been discussed so far? The answer is that we cannot join two things that are totally dissimilar in nature. As the saying goes, the birds of the same feather flock together. So there must be some similarity between the birds before they can flock together. Now, these birds that flock together may not be husband and wife or parent and child. So the flocking may not be an intimate connection between the birds. And yet there is similarity between the birds. So they can sit together, talk to each other, and feel part of the same class or category. This class or category flocking is called Brahman. It is like saying that we can put all the tables in one class, all the chairs in another class, all the beds in a third class, etc. because there is similarity between them. But we cannot put milk and poison in the same class simply because both are edible. Similarly, sparrows and falcons don't flock together just because they are birds. So the basic principle of flocking is that there must be no incompatibility between those flocking together. By this definition, even if there are two mutually inimical humans, they will not flock together simply because they are humans, because they are mutually inimical, and hence the compatibility of humanity is superficial and the incompatibility of mutual enmity is at least one incompatibility which makes it impossible to flock together. So when Krishna says that by doing your duty in an equipoised manner you will be situated in yoga, it means Arjuna will become part of the flock of birds in which Ishvara also exists. There may not be an intimate friendship or relationship like parent and child or master and servant, but there is no incompatibility between Ishvara and Jiva. Meanwhile, there is incompatibility between Ishvara and those who neglect the duties or do the duties for profit, which means they are not part of the flock of Ishvara. So Brahman liberation means that the incompatibility between Ishvara and Jiva has been removed, but a close relationship has not yet been established. So this kind of yoga is a negative conception of removing incompatibility without creating a close relationship. Brahman realization is often described as neti neti, which means not this and not that. These negations pertain to incompatibilities, like between sparrows and falcons, or between inimical humans. This is the preliminary stage of yoga in which we remove all those things that Krishna doesn't appreciate. Then gradually we can add those things that Krishna appreciates. The removal of all that Krishna doesn't appreciate is called cleansing the consciousness or chitta. Once all the dirt has been removed, then we can paint a beautiful picture on the canvas. And by doing our duties in a detached manner, we come to the point where the dirt is removed and the canvas is ready to paint a beautiful picture, although that picture will be painted in the subsequent steps. Again, Arjuna is not satisfied by this clean slate and impurity free consciousness. He wants something more. And so Krishna now enters the stage where he begins painting the canvas with a beautiful picture. We will see how Arjuna is immediately impressed by this beautiful picture and starts inquiring about it in subsequent verses. which shows how advanced he is in spiritual understanding. Arjuna stays silent on the sticks of punishment and the carrots of enjoyment, and even simply being part of the flock of similar types of birds without any antagonism between them. He wants to be an active member of Krishna's flock, which means an intimate friend, servant, or family. And so, as soon as Krishna goes beyond liberation, Arjuna breaks his silence and starts inquiring about it. However, even in these verses, Krishna doesn't directly talk about himself as Ishvara. Instead, he talks about Buddhi Yoga. Prabhupada translates all these Buddhi Yoga verses as devotional service, and many people have criticized Prabhupada for calling Buddhi Yoga devotion. So let us spend a few moments discussing Buddhi and Buddhi Yoga. Buddhi is discussed at length in later parts of Bhagavad-Gita, but the relevant part of that discussion right now is that it is superior to Manas. We generally translate Buddhi as intellect and Manas as mind. These are not exactly equivalences, and we will discuss the differences between them later. For now, I will just treat these as synonyms for convenience. Now, the traits of Manas or mind are thinking, feeling, and acting. We can call them thoughts, emotions, and actions. Sometimes I call them cognition, emotion, and relation. Prabhupada calls them thinking, feeling, and willing. All these descriptions are synonymous if we understand that willing is an action in relation to something. Ideally, that willing must be a duty, but it can be anything else too. For example, when we choose to see an apple, the senses attach to the sense objects. Later in this chapter, we will see how Krishna describes these senses moving out to attach to the sense objects as the limbs of a tortoise going in and out. And so, even to perceive an apple, our senses move out. Once the senses move outward, we get a perception, such as the ideas that the apple is red, round, and sweet, which we call thought. And then we may feel happy or sad, which is the emotion. But if the mind is unwilling, then the senses don't move out, we don't get a perception, and then we don't get a feeling. Similarly, if we see something, we may be disgusted and withdraw our senses and the mind. So, this inward and outward movement of the senses and the mind is like the limbs of a tortoise going in and out, and this process is willing. Our consciousness is not static, it rather moves in and out, and that inward and outward movement is called willing. It can also be called acting. It can also be called establishing a relationship to something other than us. And so, willing, relation, and activity are different ways of describing the movement of the consciousness. If the consciousness moves out, we say we are willing. But if the consciousness moves inward, we say we are unwilling. And so, willing is central to the working of the mind and the senses. Buddhi or intellect is higher than the manas or mind. It comprises judgments based on beliefs, goals, and morals. So, for example, if we believe that someone is a habitual liar, then we don't want to listen to them. In this case, our beliefs arrest our will and make us unwilling. Then, if we think that listening to someone will not help us achieve our goals, again, our goals arrest our willing. Finally, if we think that associating with a criminal is immoral or illegal, or by associating with them we will become their inadvertent supporters, then our morals arrest our willing. And so buddhi is like a steering wheel and brake in a car. The brake is that we don't listen to liars or those whose goals don't match with ours or with criminals. then the steering is that the beliefs, goals, and morals in the buddhi direct us towards the truthful or those whose goals match with ours or those who are virtuous. And thus the mind moves randomly if there is no buddhi because it is operating without any conception of who is a liar or who is truthful, whether associating with them is compatible with our goals or not, and whether they are sinful or virtuous people. But buddhi controls the mind. So later in Bhagavad-Gita, we will see how Krishna compares the senses to the horses of a chariot, the mind to the reins of the horses, and the buddhi to the charioteer. Thus, buddhi is our conception of truth, right, and good. Our beliefs define our notions of true and false. If we believe in some falsehood, then all truthful claims become false and all false claims become true. Similarly, good is our goals. Anything compatible with our goals becomes good, and anything incompatible becomes bad. Finally, our moral values define our sense of right and wrong. Anything compatible with our values is right, and anything incompatible with those values becomes wrong. Now, our values may not be factual morality, our goals may not be delivering the greatest good, and our beliefs may not be factually true. And so, there is a difference between truth, right, and good, and our judgments of truth, right, and good. This is why buddhi is both an instrument of judging truth, right, and good, and yet it may produce false judgments. What do we call an intellect that elevates falsehood to truth, wrong to right, or bad to good? Well, in one sense, it is intelligence, and in another sense, it is stupidity. And so, factually, every person has the instrument of judgment called intellect, and yet they can all be stupid if their beliefs, morals, and goals are incorrect. But most people get offended if we say that this person is stupid. They think that he or she is incapable of proper judgment, when all we are saying is that he has false beliefs, bad goals, and wrong values. Factually, nobody is stupid because nature has given everyone buddhi. And yet they are stupid if they hold false beliefs, bad goals, and wrong values. With this understanding of buddhi, we now come to Ishvara and Buddhi Yoga. As we have discussed in earlier videos, Ishvara is the complete truth, the greatest good, and the highest virtue. If we also think about the complete truth, the greatest good, and the highest virtue, then in one sense we are very intelligent, and in another sense we are simply thinking about Ishvara. Of course, impersonalists don't have any idea about Ishvara's body because they think all bodies are material substances or objects. But factually, as we have discussed, even material bodies comprise words rather than objects. And the complete word is Satchidanand, which means the complete right, truth, and good. So the preliminary stage of Ishvara realization is that Ishvara is simply the complete right, truth, and good. And as we discussed in the first video in the series, everyone wants right, truth, and good, and nobody wants their inversion. So everyone wants Ishvara. And so Buddhi Yoga is the beginning of a direct connection with Ishvara. This understanding of Ishvara through Buddhi is what makes Ishvara's understanding rational, moral, and blissful. Many people have tried to construct a philosophical idea of God, but because of their sectarian and exclusivist mindset, they always end up with something irrational, immoral, and miserable, rather than rationality, morality, and happiness, which nobody wants because it contradicts their own nature. And so all these sectarian and exclusivist ideologies keep adjusting their ideas. But no such adjustment is needed if we say that Ishvara is complete truth, right, and good. And so, to the newcomer to the Vedic tradition, we can teach Buddhi Yoga, which means God is truth, right, and good. Everyone wants that, so everyone can agree, and nobody wants their opposite, so they can easily reject other ideologies. For example, nobody actually wants to live with a jealous person, so nobody can actually love a jealous God. But everyone wants to live with a blissful person, so everyone can love a blissful God. In this way, theology is very easy if we define Ishvara properly. And so, Prabhupada's translation of Buddhi Yoga as devotional service is actually perfect. But to understand, we have to know that Ishvara is Satchidanand, or truth, right, and good. Meanwhile, impersonalists think that if God takes a finite form, then he cannot be infinite. But we discussed how this is false in word meaning thinking. God can be finite as a word and infinite as meaning. That is not even unique to God because even color is finite as a word and infinite as a meaning. So the finite infinite duality based on form and formless is a creation of impersonalists based on a physical conception of reality. But nothing is physical in the Vedic tradition. So we have to understand that Ishvara is the complete form of truth, right, and good, and everything else is a part of that complete truth, right, and good. Simply by taking a semantic approach, we get rid of many false ideologies. After that, intelligent beliefs, goals, and virtues are not simply ideas, but also the constituents of Ishvara's body. We may not know what part of Ishvara's body they are in the initial stages, but at least we are meditating on some part of Ishvara's body. In another sense, we can say that the self is also Satchidanand, which means its eternal nature is also truth, virtue, and bliss. So, just by knowing that we are not lies, injustice, and unhappiness, we dissociate ourselves from all the other natures that are lies, injustice, and unhappiness. Due to the commonality of the Jiva and Ishvara natures, being fixed in our eternal nature, we become fixed on some part of Krishna's nature. As we have discussed, the Jiva is a part of Krishna. So even if it fixates on its own true nature, it is fixated on a part of Ishvara and thus detached from the material nature. So Buddhi Yoga is also Krishna consciousness, provided we know that focusing on our nature is focusing on part of Krishna's nature. Only impersonalists think that they are the whole truth, virtue, and bliss, contrary to Bhagavad-Gita. They can have a problem with this description. But for personalists, Buddhi Yoga is the first milestone in a journey of knowing the nature of Ishvara. When the journey involves going from part to whole, every future step in the journey includes the previous step. And so we see Prabhupada translating many things as bhakti, which surprises, if not shocks people. But it is neither surprising nor shocking if we understand that these are part of one journey and the higher stage includes the achievements of all the previous stages. Just like calling yellow a color is not problematic, and calling color visible is also not problematic. Similarly, one who climbs this ladder sees lower stages as parts of a higher stage and calls them by the name of the higher stage. The moment Arjuna hears about the transcendental reality beyond the three guna of nature, namely tamas, rajas, and sattva, he lights up. He asks, O Krishna, what are the symptoms of those whose consciousness is thus merged in transcendence? How does he speak and what is his language? How does he sit and how does he walk? Arjuna was silent when Krishna talked about the punishment of sin. He was silent when Krishna talked about going to heavenly planets. He was silent when Krishna talked about liberation through detachment. But he speaks up after Krishna talks about transcendence. So, this is the nature of the devotees of the Lord. All this talk about punishment, reward, and liberation doesn't attract them, but they are attracted to the transcendental reality. And so we must understand that even devotees sometimes get distressed, confused, and inactive when they come across difficult situations. But that doesn't mean they are in a tamasic stage of life. And the evidence of that elevated condition is that they light up when we start discussing transcendental topics. Meanwhile, if we tell them about mundane things, they remain disinterested. So, ordinary people may be motivated by punishment, reward, or liberation, but the devotees remain inactive, confused, and distressed unless we talk to them about transcendence. Now, someone might think that we tried so many things to motivate them, but they are still distressed. That is because what motivates ordinary people doesn't motivate the devotees. Actually, Krishna himself rejects these lower conditions of rajas and tamas. When he sees that Arjuna is not motivated even by liberation, then he brings up transcendental topics. And so everyone is not given the perfect truth immediately. Rather, we rise through the ladder of punishment, reward, liberation, and transcendence. And whoever gets motivated by the lower level is left there because he won't be motivated by higher things. So, for example, we cannot motivate criminals by telling them that a far better life waits for them by leading a moral existence because they think that moral life is too hard for them. So, we have to motivate them by punishment. Then we cannot discuss liberation with a person motivated by profit because he thinks that he can get a good life if he acts morally. Finally, we cannot discuss the nature of Ishvara, with a person whose sole motivation is freeing himself from the cycle of birth, death, old age, and disease. Such a person is so self absorbed that he cannot think of anything other than his own liberation. Rising through this ladder takes a long time, and so to motivate people on this ladder, they are encouraged to follow the path of Dharma for whatever reason they find motivating. All these people motivated to follow the path of Dharma are welcomed, and yet they are not simple mindedly equalized. In the next five verses, Krishna describes the nature of Sthita Prajna or fixed consciousness. The word prajna comprises two roots, namely pra, which means expanding or advancing, and gna, which means knowledge. Sthita means stable or fixed. And so, sthita prajna is a person who is fixed in his own truth and resolutely expanding and advancing his understanding of the truth. Krishna notes five such symptoms. First, the person is fully self satisfied and doesn't need external satisfaction. Second, he is not disturbed by external difficulties and doesn't feel fear and anger. Third, he is unaffected by whatever he receives from the world, whether good or evil. Fourth, he becomes unaware of the world because his mind is absorbed in the truth. Fifth, he enjoys within himself because he has developed a higher taste. And thus, even though living in this world, as far as this body is concerned, he is living beyond this world as far as his consciousness is concerned. Many religions at present talk about going to heaven, which supposedly happens after death. Meanwhile, life on earth is lived miserably or hedonistically without any spiritual realization. So nobody factually knows what the heaven looks like or if anyone has ever been there. Even if there are some conceptions of heaven, nobody can factually verify them right now because their idea of experience is based on the body, mind, and senses. They believe that unless we go to heaven, we can never verify or know what the heaven looks like. Factually, in this way, we can't even know if we ever go to heaven. The entire theory of going to heaven and enjoying an eternal life without any direct experience of the heaven in this life is an unverifiable but elaborate fantasy. The Vedic tradition is different in the sense that it talks about how we can experience transcendence in this life. We don't have to die to know what the transcendental realm is like because it is accessible to everyone. That is because the soul's consciousness is not confined to the experience gained through the mind and the senses. The consciousness can move anywhere, see anything, and relish the experience that others claim to receive after death. Hence, these processes are also called mystical, where mystical means seeing something that others cannot see with their senses. To have this mystical experience, one has to withdraw their consciousness from the senses and the mind, which Krishna describes as a tortoise withdrawing its limbs within its own shell. The consciousness that can remain withdrawn in this way is called a purified consciousness. Their purity pertains to the renunciation of the desire to experience a world comprising sattva, rajas, and tamas. The modern or Western idea of consciousness is that it is a blank slate and it experiences something only if it exists outside of the knower. But this idea of consciousness is easily falsified by dreams, where we see a world being projected within us, which means there is a world already existing in the senses and the mind, which is projected outward as a world during a dream. As we have discussed in the first video, the waking stage is just like a dreaming stage, which means that the world we see as existing outward to us is projected from within us. And yet it corresponds to the external world because many puppets are orchestrated in a coordinated manner by Kala or time. And yet, if our senses and mind comprise the three guna, then the projected world comprises the three guna. Each guna has some pros and some cons, and the transcendental stage has the pros of all the three guna and the none of the cons. For example, the transcendental stage is at once excited, relaxed, and active. The relaxed condition is like tamoguna, but it is not ignorant. The excited stage is like rajoguna, but it is not ambitious. The active stage is like sattoguna, but it is not withdrawn. Finally, just like a dreaming mind and senses project a world that only the dreamer sees, similarly, a transcendental consciousness projects a reality which only the transcendental person sees. Therefore, the transcendental person is at once awake, dreaming, and sleeping. He is sleeping as far as the material world is concerned. He is dreaming because he is projecting a reality out of his consciousness. And he is awake because his projection is eternal truth and not a hallucination. This is what makes the transcendental state very hard to understand because it is at once waking, dreaming, and sleeping, and yet neither of the three. Similarly, the transcendental stage is at once three gunas in one sense, and in another sense, it is none of the three guna. After describing the transcendental stage of consciousness, Krishna describes how a person falls from this stage due to distractions created by the mind and the senses. Krishna says that even if one is trying to keep their consciousness fixed, the mind and the senses forcibly carry the consciousness away. As soon as a person is enticed by the mind and the senses, his consciousness is attached to the sense objects, like iron filings attracted to a magnet. This attraction is due to similarity of nature. For instance, musicians are attracted to music and other musicians. Scientists are attracted to science and other scientists. And so there is always a risk that even if someone is singing for Krishna, he may be attracted to mundane music. Or even if someone is doing science for Krishna, he may be attracted to mundane science. Such an attraction depends on the fact that each transcendental quality has something in common with a material quality and something is opposed to that quality. So by the commonality we are attracted, but eventually we realize that it is also opposed. This process of attraction and revulsion distracts a person many times from the spiritual path. And Krishna describes that distraction. He says that from attraction to the world, automatically desires arise. And then there arises an anger that we don't have the things we desire. Under this anger, a person thinks that he will be fulfilled by acquiring things he doesn't have. Immediately, he forgets his self-fulfilled and blissful nature and starts needing other things to fulfill himself. As soon as one forgets one's true nature, his mind deviates from the Ishvara, and that is the loss of buddhi or intelligence. Finally, focused on the external world, desiring material things, angry that they haven't yet been obtained, forgetting one's blissful nature, and defocused from the complete truth, virtue, and bliss, the soul again falls into the material realm. And thus Krishna warns Arjuna about the ways in which one falls from the fixed state consciousness, and then says, if Arjuna controls his mind and senses, then he will attain the highest destination of life and the Lord's mercy. These discussions again show how different the Vedic tradition is from other religions, namely, that Krishna shows the path of sense and mind control, warns Arjuna about the ways he can fall from that path, and yet there is no need to feel disappointed even if one has fallen. In fact, it is to be expected for a beginner because there is both similarity and opposition between the spiritual reality and the material reality. The process of rise and fall is internal. Meanwhile, the external symptom of the internal perfection is that one performs their duties without expecting results. So these two are mutually complementary aspects of the spiritual process. As long as one is living in the material world, he has to perform his dharma or duties. But one cannot remain fixed in their duties unless one undertakes the internal and mystical process as well. Similarly, both processes are mutually affirming. As one performs their duties diligently, he develops the ability to keep his consciousness focused on the eternal truth. And as their consciousness is focused on the eternal truth, he can perform his external duties diligently. Sometimes these two complementary processes are also called dharma and sanatan dharma. The external process of duty is dharma, and the internal process of focusing on the eternal truth is sanatan dharma. The internal truth never changes, whereas the external duties keep changing with time, place, situation, and person. And so dharma is temporary, but Sanatan Dharma is the soul's and God's eternal truth. In the first video on this series, we talked about how each living entity is controlled like a puppet in the hands of a puppeteer, or like an animal being dragged by the animal's master. That puppeteer is Lord Shiva or causal time. The ropes by which the puppeteer controls the puppet is our senses and mind. and the puppet controlled by these ropes is the jiva or the soul. And yet the jiva also has a buddhi or intellect in addition to the senses and the mind, by which it can understand the complete truth, virtue, and bliss and then focus on them. So if the buddhi or intellect is used, then the jiva becomes sthita prajna or fixed in the understanding of truth, virtue, and bliss. But if the buddhi is not used, then the jiva is dragged by the senses and the mind. Krishna gives the same example later in Bhagavad-Gita, where he says that the buddhi is like the charioteer, the mind is like the ropes, and the senses are like the horses of a chariot, and the jiva is the rider in the chariot. So the rider has to instruct the charioteer to control the senses through the reins of the mind, and then the jiva will become free of material entanglement. Otherwise, if the buddhi is not active, then the horses run wherever they want, and the mind is simply dragged by the senses. The rider is dragged in the chariot along with the uncontrolled senses and the mind. And so, control of the senses and the mind through the intellect, which knows the complete truth, virtue, and bliss, is the path of the soul's liberation. Conversely, if the intellect doesn't know the complete truth, virtue, and bliss, then the senses are uncontrolled. The mind is dragged by the senses, and the rider simply goes wherever the senses take him. So, the understanding of the complete truth, virtue, and bliss is the path to the soul's liberation, and ignorance of the actual truth, virtue, and bliss is the path to the soul's bondage. Thus, there is a clear definition of liberation and bondage, and accordingly, simply by acquiring a perfect understanding of the Ishvara, one's life is guided according to the nature of Ishvara, and then one attains liberation. We can illustrate this bondage through some modern examples. During the European Enlightenment, people realized that they did not have any epistemology to know the complete truth, virtue, and bliss. Bliss or happiness, they said, was a subjective thing, and each person had to seek their own happiness. Virtue was relative to each society, and the society could make their laws of behavior, and that became democracy. Finally, while science would try to know the truth through experiments, the data of these experiments had to be interpreted according to some axioms, which were not universal truths, but they could be institutionalized through academic consensus, which shall evolve through debate and discussion, although it could never reach an end. Meanwhile, nobody should be forced to accept a top-down version of truth, virtue, and bliss. And this freedom from oppressive regimes created by theocracies and autocracies had to be rejected. This evolutionary but never-ending notion of truth, virtue, and bliss came to be known as liberalism. Its core tenet was having the freedom to choose one's ideas of truth, virtue, and bliss. And so liberalism postponed the discovery of some complete truth, virtue, and bliss into the distant future and gave humans the power to follow their own beliefs. The net result was uncontrolled senses and mind. People began creating whatever speculative theories they found convenient for their current desires and claimed them to be the best truth, virtue, and bliss. What had not been anticipated during liberalism was that this freedom of individuals will result in enormous divergence in beliefs, values, and goals. Factually, no society could be organized if everyone had different beliefs, values, and goals. And so liberalism was quickly undermined by propaganda, and people were brainwashed to believe in some institutionalized truth, virtue, and bliss. For example, being happy meant consumerism. Being virtuous meant being tolerant of each other's vices. And being truthful meant being pragmatic or accepting whatever works today as the truth. Liberalism also operated on the assumption of linear time, and liberals began calling themselves progressive. The idea is that if we give people more and more freedom to create their own truth, virtue, and bliss, then the best ideas will automatically win, and we will then come to the best truth, virtue, and bliss. The hindrance to progress was simply the limitation on our imagination. And thus, liberalism destroyed the intellect because it allowed the mind to run amok, uncontrolled by the distinction between truth and falsehoods, virtues and vices, and happiness and distress. People assumed that by allowing freedom, the society will eventually converge, but actually it began diverging. Eventually, we got many schisms and fragments fighting with each other. This fragmentation of society is like the horses of a chariot pulling the chariot and their riders in different directions, because there is no charioteer for controlling the horses. Everyone simply thinks about what is pleasing to their senses, imagines something could be true, virtuous, or pleasing, and proclaims their freedom to believe in their creations and proselytize them to others. All these people think that they are enjoying their freedom, but according to the Vedic tradition, they are actually slaves of their senses and mind, operating under the control of causal time. They don't understand their slavery because they don't know how the senses generate desires and the mind generates thoughts. They also identify with these desires and thoughts because there is no distinction between the soul and the body. The rider, the charioteer, the reins, the horses, and the chariot become just one thing without the soul body distinction. Then people fight with each other and never come to a consensus because they relativized truth, virtue, and bliss to each individual. Ultimately, to curtail this chaos, some oppressive, autocratic, or theocratic power will again come to power, and people will return back to the same state from which liberalism was trying to take them out. What began as grandstanding about freedom will again return to bondage. And so, liberalism is not liberation. It is, in fact, a royal road to bondage. Liberation begins by knowing the complete truth, virtue, and bliss. That knowledge is true enlightenment. And with that knowledge, we can control our mind and senses, and then we can organize a progressive society. That society comprises of chariots with functioning charioteers, not one with each chariot's horses running amok. The confusion is simply that people think that liberalism is liberation from bondage, and they destroy the charioteers and think that all chariots will move in the same direction, which is simply counterfactual fiction. And therefore, whenever people talk about liberalism, we should talk about liberation. We can tell them that liberalism means bondage and liberation is possible after knowledge. Although the same term, namely liber, appears in both liberation and liberalism, they are completely opposite. One is actually bondage and the other is true freedom.